Hello, welcome back to the Download Show. Today, I'm excited to welcome Ray Ma, a seasoned investor, operator, and one of the most insightful voices on China's tech and startup ecosystem. Ray spent over a decade in finance and venture capital across both Silicon Valley and China, and she's the founder of TechBuzz China, a go-to source for deep analysis on China tech trends, companies, and culture. Her work bridges East and West with rare clarity, nuance, and context, which is exactly why I want to have this conversation with her. We're going to explore what's really happening in China's innovation landscape, the myths and realities of Chinese entrepreneurship, and how the country fits into the shifting global tech order. Welcome to the show, Ray.
Thanks for having me, Ty.
Well, first question I wanted to ask, really in light of kind of recent tariffs and kind of the shifting global geopolitics, what do you think is kind of China's response, or at least how China views what's going on?
I think that's been reported a lot by other media, so I'll just kind of regurgitate because I do think it's pretty consistent, and the government's made it really obvious, which is that they don't believe the tariffs that the U.S. has imposed is quote unquote fair. Therefore, they're not going to submit, and that explains that the retaliatory tariffs that they've put on US goods going into China. And effectively, I don't think they're willing to compromise until the system basically reverts to how it was before, or even to a more, I think, freely flowing trade schema. um, I think that no one is naive that there are going to be some sectors that are going to be hit. But I think when we're talking about the tariffs as they are, that's sort of a blanket situation here. And yeah, I don't think that's acceptable to the Chinese.
Now, but in terms of this decoupling, right? So part of the I guess the narrative is to effectively decouple from China. Now, this is something that's been going on, for a while. COVID, I think, also helped to do some of that. Do you think this is just a continuation of that trend, and certain industries are effectively decoupled anyway? Where do you think that decoupling? Where do we stand at this point?
I think it's really hard to say how how full the decoupling will be, right? And I say this, I think, as we were doing prep for this episode. Basically, it's really impossible to know where things will go because I think it's pretty clear the Trump administration doesn't have necessarily the clearest plan of what they want to achieve. Therefore, it's impossible for the rest of us to predict. That being said, I think it is pretty obvious that there is consensus that there are certain industries that are vital to national security on both sides, by the way, not just to the US side. And I think those sectors we're going to see decoupling. And the example that's relevant to tech, I think, is that, we already see AI semiconductors, not all semiconductors, but those used in artificial intelligence are effectively decoupled. And I do mean for the LLMs, not necessarily, you know, the I guess there isn't even that much, but in the future, maybe some of the more low power chips or whatever, maybe they're not subject to such scrutiny. But for now, yeah, we can see basically, I mean, what can NVIDIA do, right? Everything they push out ends up being limited and restricted when it comes to exporting to China. So effectively, I do think it's already decoupled. And as I said, even if it's not decoupled, because it is true that every time Nvidia puts out something, Chinese buyers are lining up, but that's just because the domestic supply chain hasn't fully caught up yet. I think that you know even in a case, right, like just do a thought experiment, even in the case that all restrictions are lifted off of Nvidia, I think the intent and the spirit of what everyone's thinking has been made so clear that Chinese buyers would be very stupid if they did not have a backup plan in place, if they did not support, for example, the SMICs of the country that are capable of building alternative, right? I think these days they call it strategic resilience or de-risking, right?
Mm,
So they're for sure always going to have their feet on two boats,
mm,
to invoke a Chinese
mm,
proverb.
mm. Once bitten, twice shy type of thing. Now,
Yeah.
how are the you say, well, Chinese entrepreneurs are thinking about, again, trying to decouple themselves and trying to de-risk it by obviously selling, to the U.S. and Western markets, but also trying to kind of focusing on the local markets as well. Now, are we seeing kind of domestic consumption increase of kind of tech products so that, right, or are they kind of moving abroad to other countries like Southeast Asia in order to diversify? Have you seen some of that?
I think for tech products, I mean, China's, depending on what you're talking about, right? So 3C products, consumer electronics, China's just been the leading manufacturer. And because of certain frictions between US and China, and more notably, I think because of Chinese brands just becoming more competitive in general in the past decade, there's obviously been a greater shift towards more domestic brands as they've risen in quality and design and customer service and all the softer facets. In terms of software, I think that you see Chinese entrepreneurs, yeah, starting in a decade ago, really consistently trying to sell outside of China as well. That's really accelerated as, you know, the so-called low-hanging fruit of Chinese consumer internet has been picked by all the large platform companies. So pretty much anyone who's trying to be an entrepreneur, I would say in the last 5 years, has seriously considered or is in the process of considering selling abroad outside of Chinese borders. Now, has that been very successful? Um, I think it depends on what your expectations were originally, right? If you were not expecting them to succeed at all, well, then they actually have done pretty well, especially in markets like Japan, certain pockets of Southeast Asia, and like even in Europe and the US. But obviously not to the level of success that American companies have selling to the rest of the world. So, I think that for Chinese entrepreneurs, now specifically relating to America, I think a lot of people are sort of on the fence. I've talked to quite a few Chinese companies that are very actively selling abroad and are very reluctant to expand their investment in the US. Whereas they are much more willing to expand, say in Latin America, on like fewer signals of success, I would argue, because yeah, these sort of frictions make it very difficult to um, not just difficult to justify the risk, right? Like because if it can happen, if your operations can be shut down, if you're a giant company with so much American capital and board members like a ByteDance, right? In the case of TikTok, then what protections do you really have as a small startup? And sometimes I see also that the founders themselves might be quite willing to take the risk, but they won't be able to get the support of their board, for
I see.
example.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Because I did see during, I think, post COVID and coming out, I saw there was a lot of kind of narrative dialogue about kind of the entrepreneurs going to the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and I also noted kind of very specific behaviors, right? Like, so one of the companies that I advise, Feishu, which is kind of a Slack type of Teams type, it's a combination. But I found very interesting the way they developed the app, right? So there was an entirely English version, American version, or Western version, and there was a Chinese version, and never did they meet, right? So I basically couldn't log on to the same portal unless, yeah, I actually had the Chinese version as well. So I guess what you're saying is that they still want to go abroad, but they are being extremely careful on where they go. And then I guess on the legal structure as well, how they actually do it and how they execute that.
Yeah, but I think, if you have substantially your engineering and founders be Chinese, I just think that's it's always a risk. Because again, the spirit, right, behind a lot of this friction is not really something you can get out of just by having, legal structures. It's really like the sort of the Chinese-ness of the team.
I wanted to kind of actually, this kind of memory made me think about actually a very popular piece in the FT, I think almost a year ago, about venture capital scene, having that kind of changing as well fundamentally.
Mhm.
So,
Was it the one that got like debunked because it was
correct. Yeah, that's the one.
now
Right,
like
that's the one.
95%? Okay, yeah,
Yeah. So just to give some reference, right? So it was that it was almost maybe six months ago that the venture capital scene has all entirely but evaporated because foreign investors have left. And the state is actually putting capital with certain restrictions as well, which includes, I think, there was some sort of a personal liability as well. Where have we kind of where is the Chinese venture capital scene now?
yeah. So I was definitely one of the people who like spoke out against some of the stats cited in that article, but they're not fully wrong. There are lots of signals that and data, right, that support the fact that there has been is definitely a slowdown in investment. By the way, that's kind of global, right?
Agreed. Agreed.
It's kind of the effect of ending zero interest rates. So, um, the fact of the matter is that uh, the personal liabilities and some of these more um, harsh clauses, I guess, that you would find in term sheets from venture capitalists. They've actually always existed in China, right? And what I would say is that when USD funds, who generally have much looser terms, were they weren't actually ever maybe the fully dominant VC in terms of amount deployed, but they were in the hottest companies and in the most visible and fast growing companies and had the best returns probably for a good, 2 decades actually. Uh, and that sort of masked, right, the harsh terms because you'd have a lot of these US VCs actually getting progressively, basically reaching parity of what term sheets look like in the US. And by the way, that also wasn't completely static either. Even if you look at Silicon Valley term sheets from the early 2000s to what they look like today, right? They still look different. They're much less restrictive, right? Because the landscape of financing has changed and capital outlay. So the fact that now USD funds are basically disappearing in China because limited partners no longer, for various reasons, geopolitical or risk management or whatever it is, don't want to be in Chinese domiciled companies. Yeah, you do see some of those terms pulling away, and then the more quote unquote local flavored terms kind of seeing a resurgence, right? That, and you do have the fact that there's a lot more state capital involved. Um, while it is called state capital, most of it, if you peek behind the curtain and the name, is not necessarily money from the government. It's usually some startup capital from the government and some oversight from some government affiliated or maybe state owned enterprise affiliated people. But a lot of the capital actually comes from private, right? From they call it society in China. So
But
uh,
even from that, from the society, there are levels, right? There. I remember there was like city funds. There's
yeah,
like
yeah, they're really
province
decentralized.
funds.
Yeah,
Yeah, right.
absolutely. Yeah. And but that's always existed in China's development history, is and especially when it comes to tech VC. It's just that these weren't the funds that were getting the best deals. They weren't, the funds that were the most exciting to work with because you had, in contrast, right, like these US VCs, and they weren't run by Americans necessarily, they were run by Chinese people on the ground, but they were like Sequoia China or like Lightspeed China or whatever it was, Silicon Valley sub branches out there that were moving at much faster speeds and giving much more freedom in their term sheets that made them more attractive, especially if you're going for a US listing. Now the US listing route it's still open. It's actually open. It's quite open today, but it's kind of risky, right? And because there's a constant fear of being delisted, right? Like that's just always a thing that's on the table when it comes to this administration or even the last one. And just I think it just in contrast, you have a lot more deep tech companies that actually for their own risk management reasons, if not for actual regulatory reasons, want Chinese capital, right? So I can give you an example of an AI company. It's not one of the more recent ones. It was founded probably 10 years ago. I spoke to them. This is now like 3, 4 years ago. So it's when things weren't even as tense as it is today. But they were working with Chinese financial institutions. So think like the largest banks in China, who are both shareholders and customers. And because those are considered state-owned enterprises, this company could not raise money from a foreign entity until they went public. Yeah, and then of course it becomes different rules. But in their pre-IPO fundraisings, they were not explicitly forbidden to, but were basically told that they would have to jump through so many hoops to get foreign capital that it just made it not worth their time. Yeah. And it
Now,
wasn't any,
yeah,
national rule. It was just like rules imposed because like that's just how the state-owned capital worked.
yeah. Now, do you see then? I think Robert Wu also kind of made a kind of retort against that as well. I think I saw on his blog and also on LinkedIn. So now, kind of, are you hearing or seeing trends where companies are maybe taking more of a bootstrap model? So maybe taking the capital if they can, if no other recourse, more willing to bootstrap, and then maybe again it's too early to say, but are the exit paths then also going to look different with the changing landscape?
I think bootstrapping is always the preferred option for especially seasoned entrepreneurs, unless you have to raise capital, right? Like second time, third time entrepreneurs always prefer not to raise capital no matter what geography they're in, unless they have to because they want more control over their own company. I think that's really up to the entrepreneur and the stage of development they are in and how capital intensive their business is. I don't think that's, a greater percentage. However, I think for you were asking about, sorry, what were you
The
asking about?
both, I think, the entrepreneur, at least what are some of the other
Yeah,
recourses they have, and then, or at least how they think
yeah,
about capital allocation or
yeah, yeah.
investment capital, and then possible again, maybe too early, but possible exit path or trajectories.
Yeah. So I think on the exit paths, it is a little too early to say. A lot of companies I know are preparing for domestic listings, uh, but have not like chosen a structure that explicitly, prevents them. Because there's always ways to like legally, redo your structure so that you can go list overseas. But I think right now, because the capital is more available in RMB for most businesses, they are choosing, structures that can raise RMB, and so are not your, necessarily your Cayman Islands, whatever entities like before. Although, to be honest, I think a lot of them have it anyway. But I think that the exits in the future are just like too far away to tell. If we are to believe, though, the Chinese government, it's that they will do everything they can to make sure that domestic companies can exit domestically. Now, we've seen various iterations of this, and none of them have fully worked out to be as easy as the US capital markets. But the US capital markets are just unrivaled in the world, right? We have like 60% of the world's market cap here. So I don't know how, I don't think that's necessarily like something the Chinese government can, you know, make out of thin air because, you can't force the global asset managers to come to China.
Now they are trying to attract, I guess, I think President Xi hosted a couple meetings with, I think Larry Fink was there. I think Tim Cook was there. So I guess they're really trying to attract, or at least kind of project confidence to foreign investors. I also know that you have a trip with Tech Buzz China coming up in the summer, where you're also trying to show people, for investors, China and what's going on behind kind of the curtain. Can you tell us a little bit more about the trip? And yeah, what are you hoping to achieve?
Yeah, I mean, what we're hoping to achieve is just like we write about the Chinese, leading companies and startup innovations, actually mostly large company innovations at TechBuzz China for our investor newsletter. So we already take investors to China to visit electric vehicle companies. And so many people have been asking us about AI. We actually did not write that much about AI until recently. That it just seemed like a good opportunity to open up opportunity. It seemed like a good opportunity to open it up to non-investors, so founders, industry executives, anyone really can apply to attend. It overlaps with the World AI Conference in China, and we really are doing that mainly because all the companies are going to be there and have their products available to demo, and probably, some level of management available to chat. So we're going to host some events around the conference, visit some interesting companies, and hopefully come away with a more, nuanced and detailed understanding of what's happening there. Because it is a really interesting market, right? I mean, I think DeepSeek is the catalyst for everyone outside of China to be like, oh, there's interesting stuff happening there.
Fantastic. Well, on that note, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.